On February 4, 1938, Adolf Hitler seized direct control of Germany's armed forces. From that moment on, the Field Marshal's baton, the highest symbol of German military honor, stopped being a reward for strategic brilliance and became something far more dangerous. Between 1938 and 1945, 26 men were promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler. Not one escaped consequences. Some died by suicide. Others were forced to swallow poison. Several were executed by the Allies. A few survived, but only after prisons, disgrace, or years of silence. None were killed in direct combat. This is not a story of battlefield deaths. It is the story of power, loyalty, and how absolute command corrodes every rank beneath it. From triumph to collapse, from medals to gallows, this documentary follows how Hitler's top commanders met their final fate, and why the baton became a ledger of reckoning.
The story begins before the war. In 1938, Hitler dismantled the traditional Prussian command structure. Field marshals like Werner von Blomberg, Minister of War, fell not in battle but through scandal, removed after Hitler used his marriage as pretext to purge independent officers. At the same time, Walther von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, remained in place, but under constant pressure. Hitler distrusted the old officer class, viewing them as arrogant and disloyal. Promotions were no longer about institutional merit. They became personal instruments of control. When war came in September 1939, the baton was already politicized. Loyalty mattered more than caution. Victory would be rewarded instantly. Failure or hesitation would be punished just as quickly. The Field Marshal rank was no longer the end of a career. It was the beginning of dependence.
After the fall of France in June 1940, Hitler promoted 12 generals to Field Marshal in a single day. It was unprecedented. Men like Wilhelm Keitel, Gerd von Rundstedt, Fedor von Bock, and Albert Kesselring received the baton not merely for strategy, but for obedience. Keitel, head of the OKW, became the symbol of submission, signing criminal orders without protest. Others accepted promotion, knowing it tied them directly to Hitler's decisions. There were no naval field marshals because the Kriegsmarine had its own equivalent, Grand Admirals Erich Raeder and Karl Donitz. Both would later be convicted at Nuremberg, a reminder that no branch escaped judgment. By Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the hierarchy was bloated. Authority flowed upward, but responsibility would soon flow back down, with deadly consequences.
The invasion of the Soviet Union exposed the limits of loyalty. Field marshals, such as Fedor von Bock and Gerd von Rundstedt, warned of overextension. Hitler ignored them, and then removed them. At Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943, one day before surrender. The message was unmistakable. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus lived, but only as a prisoner of the Soviets. Others watched carefully. Promotion now carried a threat. Survival meant obedience. Disobedience meant disgrace, or worse. From this point forward, the baton no longer symbolized honor. It marked men for psychological pressure, political loyalty tests, and ultimately, irreversible choices.
By 1942, Erwin Rommel was Germany's most famous field marshal. Celebrated after North Africa, he was also increasingly alarmed by Hitler's interference in the widening war. After being wounded in July 1944 during an Allied air attack in Normandy, Rommel was no longer at the front when the July 20 assassination attempt failed. Evidence of his contacts with resistance figures was indirect, but enough. Hitler could not execute a national hero publicly. On October 14, 1944, Rommel was given a choice: suicide in exchange for a state funeral or trial before the People's Court, followed by execution and reprisals against his family. Rommel swallowed cyanide in a staff car near Herrlingen. Officially, he died of wounds. The truth would not emerge until after the war. The baton had spared him battlefield death, but not political survival. As Allied armies broke out of Normandy in August 1944, Hitler replaced commanders at a frantic pace. Günther von Kluge, Field Marshal in the West, attempted to stabilize the front while secretly probing for negotiation channels. Suspected of disloyalty after the July plot, he was recalled to Berlin. On August 18, 1944, Kluge committed suicide by poison while traveling east. His death removed another senior officer without a trial. His replacement, Walter Model, was different: fanatically loyal, ruthless, and known as Hitler's fireman. Model accepted impossible commands. In April 1945, encircled in the Ruhr pocket, Model dissolved his army group and shot himself rather than surrender. Neither man was killed by the enemy. Both were consumed by collapse and expectation. The failed assassination of Hitler on July 20, 1944, marked a turning point. For field marshals linked to the old Prussian tradition, there would be no mercy. Erwin von Witzleben, recalled from retirement, was named to lead the army in a post-Hitler government. After the plot failed, he was arrested, humiliated, and tried by Roland Freisler's People's Court. On August 8, 1944, Witzleben was executed by hanging, filmed for Hitler's review. Others were interrogated, dismissed, or driven to suicide. The rank no longer offered protection. From this moment, the Field Marshal's baton ceased to be a symbol of command. It became a marker of suspicion, of surveillance, and of how quickly prestige turned into a death sentence. The Luftwaffe produced more field marshals than any other branch, but none could stop its decline. Hermann Göring, promoted Reichsmarschall in 1940, stood above all others. Once Hitler's closest ally, he presided over defeat in the Battle of Britain, the failure of air supply at Stalingrad, and the loss of air superiority. By 1945, Göring was stripped of power and arrested by the SS. Others followed. Albert Kesselring survived the war, but was convicted by a British military court for war crimes in Italy, later released due to illness. Hugo Sperling was dismissed and arrested, but never convicted. Air power had promised decisive victory. In the end, its field marshals outlived their authority, but not the consequences of command. At the center of Hitler's war stood the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Wilhelm Keitel, promoted Field Marshal in 1940, embodied unconditional obedience. He signed orders authorizing executions, reprisals, and the treatment of Soviet prisoners, often against the advice of legal officers. Alongside him was Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations, who planned campaigns while facilitating criminal directives. Neither commanded armies in the field. Their power came from proximity to Hitler. Captured in May 1945, both were tried at Nuremberg. Keitel and Jodl were convicted on all counts. On October 16, 1946, Keitel was hanged. Jodl followed the same morning. Their batons did not save them. Their signatures condemned them. In the final months of the Reich, Hitler continued to promote field marshals, even as defeat became unavoidable. In April 1945, as Soviet artillery closed in on Berlin, men like Ferdinand Schorner received the baton not for victory, but for loyalty and brutality. Schorner enforced discipline through executions and terror. Captured by the Americans, he was later handed to the Soviets, imprisoned, and eventually released.
Others, like Robert Ritter von Grime, promoted Field Marshal on April 25, 1945, flew into Berlin under fire and took his own life days later. These were not promotions of confidence. They were symbols of denial. The baton no longer marked command. It marked the end.
By the war's end in May 1945, a striking fact became unavoidable. Not a single German field marshal had been killed in direct combat by enemy forces. Instead, most were captured by the Americans, British, or Soviets, alive, disarmed, and defeated. Gerd von Rundstedt, Germany's most senior officer, was taken by the British. Friedrich Paulus remained in Soviet captivity. Albert Kesselring surrendered in Italy. Even Hermann Göring, once second only to Hitler, surrendered voluntarily to U.S. forces in Bavaria. The absence of battlefield deaths fed later criticism. To many observers, the men who planned and prolonged the war seemed to avoid the fate suffered by millions of soldiers. Survival itself became a source of resentment. The baton had not led them to glory, but it had kept them alive.
Justice after the war was uneven. At Nuremberg, only a handful of senior commanders faced the full weight of international law. Keitel and Jodl were executed. Others, including Kesselring, received long sentences, later reduced. The two Grand Admirals, Erich Raeder and Karl Donitz, equivalent in rank to field marshals, were convicted but served limited terms. Raeder was released in 1955, Donitz in 1956. Both lived quietly afterward. Critics argued that political realities of the Cold War softened justice. West Germany needed stability. The Allies needed allies. Punishment gave way to pragmatism. The baton's final meaning shifted again, not from honor to shame, but from accountability to compromise.
For those who survived prison, the end came slowly. Rundstedt died in 1953. Brauwich, dismissed years earlier, died in British custody in 1948. Sperley lived until 1953, never convicted. Schorner died in 1973, after years in and out of prison. These were not triumphant retirements. Most lived in obscurity, isolated from public life, carrying reputations they could not erase. The Field Marshal's baton did not secure immortality. It secured memory and judgment. Decades later, historians would still argue which fate was worse: execution, suicide, or a long life defined by defeat. The story was no longer about how they fought, but how power had changed them.
Hitler did not inflate the rank of Field Marshal by accident. Each promotion served a purpose. In moments of victory, the baton was a reward meant to bind generals personally to him. In moments of crisis, it became a leash, raising men so publicly that failure would destroy them. Unlike the Prussian tradition, where rank reflected institutional trust, Hitler's system bypassed checks and balance. Competence mattered less than loyalty. Skilled officers who questioned him, like Brauchitsch or Rundstedt, were sidelined. Those who complied, like Keitel, rose. This explains the paradox of the war. Some of Germany's most capable commanders were dismissed, while politically reliable ones remained. The baton was never about command alone. It was a psychological contract, binding survival to obedience.
As the war turned against Germany, field marshals became shields for Hitler's failures. Defeats at Stalingrad, North Africa, and Normandy were blamed downward. Promotions that once signaled favor now ensured responsibility. Men like Paulus were elevated precisely when no escape remained. Others, like Model, were sent to impossible fronts to delay collapse. When defeat followed, dismissal or death absorbed the consequences, while Hitler's authority remained untouched. This pattern explains why few field marshals openly rebelled.
Resistance meant not only death, but disgrace and punishment of families. Survival required compliance. Power did not free these men, it trapped them until there were no safe choices left.
Among all outcomes, execution, suicide, prison, or survival, historians still debate which final fate carried the greatest weight. Rommel's forced suicide showed how even fame offered no protection. Keitel's execution demonstrated that obedience was not a defense. Paulus's captivity revealed the cost of choosing life over legend. Perhaps the most revealing fate belonged to those who lived long after, men who outlasted the regime, but not its shadow. They survived judgment, yet never escaped association with the war they enabled. The Field Marshal's baton promised permanence. Instead, it recorded consequence. Power elevated these men, but in the end, it stripped them of everything it had promised.
In the years after the war, many asked why so few German field marshals were executed. The answer lies less in mercy than in circumstance. By 1945, the Allies prioritized stability over retribution. Europe was shattered. A new conflict with the Soviet Union loomed. Trials required evidence, witnesses, and political consensus. Only those directly tied to criminal orders, like Keitel and Göring, met that threshold. Others, though complicit, fell into legal gray zones. This outcome angered survivors and historians alike. Justice appeared incomplete, yet it reflected the limits of post-war law. The baton did not guarantee punishment or protection. It exposed the gap between moral responsibility and legal accountability.
Another question persists. Why did no German field marshal die in battle? The answer lies in structure, not chance. Field marshals were rarely at the front lines. Their role was command, coordination, and presence near headquarters, far from direct fire. As the war worsened, Hitler also pulled senior commanders back, fearing assassination or defection. Survival became strategic. In earlier wars, senior officers often shared frontline risk. Under Hitler, command became centralized and insulated. The distance between decision and consequence widened until it became absolute. The absence of battlefield deaths was not cowardice. It was the design of a system where power flowed upward, but danger did not.
Taken together, the final fates of Germany's field marshals reveal a pattern. Power did not merely test these men, it reshaped them. Some surrendered conscience for loyalty. Others delayed resistance until it was meaningless. A few tried to step aside and were destroyed anyway. The rank did not create monsters, it amplified choices. By the end, the Field Marshal's baton had become a symbol not of military excellence, but of proximity to unchecked authority. Each promotion narrowed options. Each order carried weight that could not be undone. This is why their endings still matter. They show how systems reward obedience, and how quickly honor can erode when power goes unchallenged.
By the time the war ended, the Field Marshal's baton had recorded more than rank. It had recorded consequence. 26 men accepted it between 1938 and 1945. Their fates followed a narrow path: suicide, execution, imprisonment, disgrace, or long survival under shadow. Some were loyal, some were competent, some were both, yet none escaped the structure they served. The system rewarded obedience, punished hesitation, and destroyed independence. Even those who resisted late, like Rommel or Witzleben, were already trapped by earlier choices. This was not collective madness. It was administrative power working as designed. Authority flowed upward, responsibility flowed downward, and accountability arrived only after collapse. The baton did not corrupt these men overnight. It documented how far they had already gone.
80 years later, the final fate of Germany's field marshals still unsettles because it feels familiar. Systems that reward loyalty over competence do not collapse suddenly. They hollow out slowly until only obedience remains. None of these men were powerless, yet power narrowed their choices, isolated them from reality, and bound survival to compliance. When the reckoning came, rank offered no escape, only different forms of ending. The Field Marshal's baton promised legacy. It delivered a warning. Not about Germany alone, not about one war, but about what happens when authority goes unchallenged and responsibility is deferred until it is too late. History did not forget these men. It measured them by how they used power and how it finally used them.